Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, the other day, our federal government released its budget for 2024-2025 fiscal year, and I thought that we should talk about it a little bit. And then I got an email from a guy that I think quite highly of. His name is Nic Ruszkowski. He is the head of Tactics, Government Relations, and Public Affairs, and he has a new way, he says, a new data science way of analyzing budgets and whether they're any good and whether they resonate with people. So I thought it would be interesting, number one, to talk about the budget, but then number two, talk about how Nic is thinking about analyzing budgets and the impact that it's having on all of us. So Nicholas Ruszkowski, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you so much, Brian, for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I got this, interesting email, and it said that you have a novel approach to budget analysis. Please, sir, what's your novel approach to
Well,
budget
we have a
analysis?
novel approach to issue analysis and issue management, but we were able to apply it to the budget thanks to the novel way, or the, how shall we say, different way in which the Trudeau government chose to roll out its budget. So you know that typically budgets wait until budget day, and then there's a massively ceremonial event that happens, and we get the benefit of people being in lockups, being briefed by officials on every important aspect of the budget. And we then write notes feverishly to our clients about the substance of that document, and that's very important work. But this year, on March 27th, the government started a new habit for it, which harkens back to the days of Paul Martin, in which it chose every day between the 27th of April, of March, and the 16th of April to release a new and important substantive component of its budget. And that meant that we had roughly a 2.5 to 3 week window in which to measure on a real time basis using data science that's available to us to measure the impact on social media in the public domain of these announcements on what I would say are voter attitudes in response to the budget. So we were able to do that for the budget, when normally what we do is we do that for what I would call highly engaging, high-profile news items or issues that are playing out in the public domain in real time.
So I found your numbers fascinating, and I guess this was up to budget day, not after budget day, and so therefore we don't know the actual impact, at least in what you sent me, of the budget itself, but just the announcements. But it's a little bit both, because what you show is that the people that approve of the prime minister went down from 36% on March the 26th, March 27th, to 30% earlier this week. So he actually had a 6-point decline in approve, but the somewhat approve went up from 23% to 35%, a 12% increase, a dramatic increase. And so the total of the two went from, what's that, 59 to
59 to
65.
65, yeah.
That's a huge, and the disapprove went down from 26 to 21.
Yeah.
So the people that really like him don't really like him as much, but the people that sort of like him went up. So what does that mean?
I think, to put it in the shortest and simplest possible terms, I think it means two things for us that we're paying attention to. The first is, overall, it seems that the Prime Minister has done a good job of increasing the pool of Canadian voters who are willing to look at his government with a sense of approval. However, it also tells us that the approval upon which he stands is, shall we say, still rather soft and shaky. And so whether the trend that we observed over a 3 week period actually turns into a trend and is sustained over time will depend on how much the budget resonates over the course of the coming weeks and months with Canadians, as those budget items turn from policy ideas to proposals to implemented policies, and the impact that they will be seen to have on people's pocketbooks on the one hand, and their mentality in response to the government on the other. And so I think that he did himself a favor by getting more people to pay attention with a potentially favorable bias to the program that he's proposing. but he confirmed what all of the traditional approaches to polling have been saying for a while, which is that he's standing on relatively shaky ground at the moment.
I found it interesting that you track different announcements and you have a positive versus negative favorability ratio. And just to give you the numbers, one was on the National Food Program, and it's 1.5 positives for every negative. And then defense announcements was negative three negatives for every one positive.
Yeah.
But then all the stuff on housing was 2.5 positives for every negative. And then artificial intelligence announcements were 11 positives for every negative.
Yeah.
So what is he doing right with artificial intelligence and sort of housing that he's doing so wrong with food and particularly with defense?
Well, I would disagree with you a little bit on the food front. I would say that the food front is probably the announcement that captured the largest amount of imagination. There's more people talking about the national food program in schools than are talking about those other three issues combined. And so he clearly captured public attention and public imagination there. I think what we see is there are 1.5 times more positive mentions than negative mentions on that issue. That's still a very good score. And given the breadth of the attention that it got, I would say that he did very well on that one as well. Um, the AI one is fascinating. I think what happened there is that he was speaking to a very well, narrowly focused group of individuals who are seized with generative AI from the perspective of actually adopting it for business purposes and incorporating it into the development and innovation of their business. Some technology companies themselves are looking at that. And he showed a degree of forethought in the Canadian context that will be meaningful to the folks who are most specialized and seized with issues of innovation, especially as it relates to AI. But it was probably not a large enough audience to make a big dent in his support over time. The housing front, oddly enough to us, did not get as much play as the announcement on the National Food Program. But it does speak to the very central preoccupations that Canadians have about housing affordability. And you might recall that the housing announcements in the budget focus especially on what I'm going to call renters' considerations and renters' rights. And I think that was the first expression of true support for people who aren't homeowners to emerge over the course of the last year and a half or two about housing conversations. And so I think it registered with an element of the electorate that hasn't seen itself reflected in policy yet. Defense, I think, is a fascinating issue. On the one hand, it's a significant need of the Canadian government to meet its commitments to NATO. The Ministry of Defense, or sorry, the Department of National Defense, certainly the military brass, and it now appears the political establishment have determined that it's a leadership moment for Canada to sort of step up its investment and its involvement in the funding of initiatives that are designed to protect us geopolitically, whether it's in Ukraine or through other NATO initiatives. But it's not the first time that the general public tells us that that's not a high priority for them and that they would rather see those levels of investment directed at other priorities. So, sometimes the price you pay for leadership is having to make a difficult decision on an unpopular topic. But
That's interesting. I thought initially you were going to tell me that people wanted him to show more leadership and accelerate his spending and get up to the 2%, but you're saying of GDP, that's our NATO commitment. But you're saying no. The negative was people not wanting him to spend the money that he's committed to spend, even though it's nowhere close to the 2%.
sorry, yes, but the budget does signal a pursuit of the 2% target that's rather unambiguous. So there's probably in the conversation about those topics, I would say, without venturing too much into the detail, because I'd have to look at it in a more granular way, probably a significant number of people that are opposed to the 2% in general and expressing that opposition, given the number of needs that lay before us right now. And there are others who are probably also saying it's too little, too late, and not enough is being done. But it's an issue where it's very hard to, how shall we say, satisfy everyone. in the context of the Canadian political environment.
Now you're teasing us because you sent out this email prior to the announcement of the budget. Have you done these numbers post the budget announcement as well?
Well, you might not be surprised to hear that we were very intrigued by the very significant amount of play that the capital gains tax issue has received since being revealed on budget day. And so we are looking at that very closely. And in the same way that we spent roughly 3 weeks looking at the battery of announcements made by the Liberal government moving forward towards budget day, we're going to be looking at how things evolve over the next 7 days and give you guys an update in roughly 7 days from now about how it is that these new, previously unknown aspects of the budget have played out. And without being able to tell you exactly what we're going to find, I think we will find that capital gains will have created a huge amount of engagement. Will probably have created some criticism amongst the folks who are beneficiaries of capital gains from their investments and from their professional activities, and will probably also prove quite popular with people who believe that a little bit more redistribution of the wealth is required. So I'm curious to see how that plays out from an approvals and engagement perspective.
We're chatting with Nic Ruszkowski tonight about the federal budget and about some data analysis that he's doing about whether sort of pre-announcements of different factors have been popular with people or not. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Nicholas Ruszkowski. He is with Tactics, Government Relations and Public Affairs. He's got a really interesting background. He's an expert in strategy, crisis risk management, and public affairs with 28 years experience leading multilingual, multifaceted companies. He's been the managing principal and co-owner of Tactics Government Affairs for the last couple of years. Before that, he was the Vice President, Public Legal and Corporate Affairs of the National Capital Commission. And before that, he was the Chief Operating Officer of the Senators Sports and Entertainment, and then Executive Vice President, U.S. Head of Strategy and Growth with MSL Group. And so he's got some interesting experiences in his background. Nick and I have had the opportunity to work together and argue vehemently about some issues that we were passionate about in the past. And so that is kind of fun. Nick, you reference in your email that this sort of strategy of announcing things prior to budget day was a strategy that Paul Martin, when he was prime minister, used, or I guess when he was finance minister, used. Other people left everything until budget day and made it all a surprise, and you had the big lockup, and everything was a surprise when you went to lockup. What do you think of those two strategies? You're an expert not only in analyzing, but in public relations and government affairs. What do you think of the strategy? Is it smart or is it not smart?
I think it's never a question of one size fits all. I think you have to choose the right approach for the circumstances. If you cast your ideas and your mind back to what Paul Martin and his prime minister at the time, Jean Chrétien, was trying to achieve, they were having to make some very courageous and complicated and difficult political decisions to reduce federal funding of some major initiatives to get the deficit under control and public debt under control. And so in an environment where you're having to deliver bad news, it makes a lot of sense to give yourself every opportunity to contextualize the work that you're trying to do from a budget making perspective so that you can help the pill go down a little bit more smoothly. And in the same way, when you're making the transition from those deficit slaying budgets to budgets that allow you to show some investment based on the fact that you've been able to successfully wrestle the budget down to the ground, you likewise want to give your good news as long a tail as humanly possible, given the importance of that in helping build political credentials to help a government get reelected. So I think Paul Martin had a very appropriate strategy for the time. I think it's fair to say that one would find it difficult to find fault with the approach that the Trudeau government has traditionally had to budget making, given their success politically over the course of the last 8 or 9 years. But it's also difficult to ignore the fact that this year, in particular, the Trudeau government found itself in a significantly different position, trailing the Conservative opposition by anywhere from 10 to 20 points, depending on the week and depending on the poll that you were looking at. And so I think that in an effort to try and create as much awareness as humanly possible about the good work that the Liberal government believes it's doing, and B, about the areas in which it may contrast with its Conservative opposition, the Liberal Party government thought it was a good idea to deploy a similar strategy. And on the surface of it, it seems to have worked in terms of moving some of the call it reservations about the Prime Minister, having softened some of those reservations, at least with those who are watching the budget a little bit more closely than others. And so one has to say that it was a fruitful exercise in that regard. One cannot yet say whether that exercise will matter in the long run. Like I said, there's evidence to suggest that the support, even though it's improving, remains rather soft where it exists. And so the question is whether any of these changes will materialize into lasting support for the Prime Minister or not.
You mentioned that this discussion of AI was targeted at a group, and he got huge amount of response within that group. This budget seems to have been very targeted at young people. A lot of the commentary has been about how there was almost an emotional address within the budget in regards to the inequity between the generations, and that the housing crisis, more than almost anything else, has created a situation where young people just don't have the economic prosperity, at least outlook for economic prosperity, that the prior generations have enjoyed. Do you think that makes sense to appeal so significantly to one segment of society?
Well, how would I? That's a big question, Brian. I don't know how concise I can be. I would say that from the point of view of being a government that has the responsibility to serve all Canadians, it is important to keep in mind that that the government exists to serve each one of the people that comprise and compose this country. For political reasons, it is important to go and maximize your support where it can make the most amount of difference. I won't be the first person to observe that one of the trends that might be concerning to the Liberal government is the fact that a large number of a younger voting cohort is starting to express some interest and some enthusiasm for the Conservative opposition. So given the important role that cohort of voters has played in prior Liberal governments in terms of forming both the original majority and the minorities that the Liberals now have, I think they feel it's important to defend that particular ground and to hold it. And by the way, that's a dynamic that's not just playing out in Canada. It's a dynamic that's going to play out fiercely in the U.S. election, where you can see that the numbers between Trump and Biden are so tight that if Biden isn't able to maximize his 18 to 34-year-old support, he's going to find re-election quite a bit more difficult than he wants it to be. So I think there are moments in a political party's and in a government's life where you play to your strengths and you try and shore up some of the weaknesses that are the most concerning to you in terms of salvaging and strengthening your electoral prospects. And that's likely what was at play there with the very youth-focused thematic of this budget.
Well, I happen to also believe it is probably one of the biggest issues. I do think there is a generational inequity that has grown to absurd amounts right now in our country, where it costs an outrageous amount of money to buy a home, such that my kids can't have any prospects of thinking they're ever going to be able to afford a single family home, at least in Mississauga or Toronto. And that was the dream of my generation, or the generation of my father and mother. And so I do think that increasing supply, bringing house prices down, and also all the efforts to build more purpose-built rental. And if you take a look at the statistics, we're building about the same number of houses today that we were building in the 1970s. in single family homes. Condos have gone up. Rentals have gone down dramatically. We're hardly building any. At least we have been hardly building in the last little while any rental. And the only rental that really was adding to the marketplace was investors buying condos and then turning around and renting them out. So I think it is an important issue. That said, it's interesting the strategy. I saw some statistics. You may know this far better than I, that in the initial Trudeau election, if the same people had come to the polls that had come to the polls in the prior election, Stephen Harper would have won. And the reason why Justin Trudeau won that was because of a dramatic increase in the turnout with young people and newcomers. And some people credited it with a policy for the decriminalization of marijuana that attracted a whole bunch of younger people to come out and vote for the Liberal Party. If that's true, that what he did with one policy was attract a whole bunch of new people, that hadn't voted in previous elections, and the surge in that voting bloc went up, and they tended to vote for the Liberal Party, and Trudeau then won a majority. It's not a bad strategy right now.
Yeah, I think we agree in this case, Brian. You're saying in a different way what I was trying to say earlier, which is, Trudeau knows he was elected in large part thanks to a young voter cohort in 2015. The path to re-election, certainly in his view, depends on continuing to be able to mobilize that cohort of voters. And at the current moment, the rapid increase in the cost of living that we've experienced over the last number of years and the difficulty of access to housing ownership are two of the issues that are the most concerning to that cohort of voters. And so I think that you and I are in alignment on that. There is one other thing that I should point out that was not relevant to our budget note, but we have done a separate piece of research to try and understand what the source of the underlying anger that Canadians have been expressing over the last couple of years might be. And when you take the approach that we take to our research, which is not to ask any questions. We don't have a questionnaire. We don't assemble a panel of respondents. We simply randomly sample large representative groups of Canadians who are talking about the issues of the day online. And so when you do that and you ask, or when you listen to people and you are keen enough to figure out what it is that they're talking about, our artificial intelligence tells us that there is an increasing amount of social anxiety around the idea of being isolated from community, friends, family, the workplace. And so that tells you that at a moment where cost of living is expensive, cost of housing is expensive, the consequences of not finding employment that's viable in that environment is having a very significant impact on the psychology of people in all generations, but presumably especially in this younger cohort of voters. And so I think that, the Prime Minister often gets accused of being tone deaf, but I think in this particular case, for me, the renters announcement, for example, was a very fine example of him having keyed into some of that social anxiety and tried to do something concrete to address it.
I was in the airport last night, and I saw two people wearing these hockey jerseys that I think it was Polyev pushed through or something like that. And these were young guys, probably in their late 20s, early 30s. There's a whole segment of society, of young people, I think, that were, I don't know whether they were supporter of the trucker convoy or, the people that were clamoring for freedom and no vaccine mandates and no masks and things like that. But there seems to be a group of people that have been very supportive of the current leader of the Conservative Party that seem to me very similar to the MAGA people in the United States. They're dressing in things. They're wearing caps. They're flying flags on their pickup trucks. Where is that all coming from, do you think, Nick?
I think the person who figures that out will probably be the next Prime Minister of Canada. We can probably say that with confidence in terms of not only how to tap into it, but also to try and understand its root causes so that they can address solutions that have a realistic chance of making a difference in those areas. Um, One of the people that I have the privilege of knowing, a gentleman by the name of Akash Maharaj, who lives in the Ottawa area, but spends a lot of time in Toronto and elsewhere, thinking deeply about these issues, has remarked that one of the first harbingers of social isolation that we may have witnessed over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, um, just before the pandemic and then through the pandemic, is actually related to the impact of the opioid crisis, especially in suburban and rural areas, and how precarious family living and community living has become in those areas that have been afflicted by the kinds of addictions that have come with the opioid crisis. So um, I'm not here to say that that's the totality of the response, but I think that when you think of the nature of addiction, when you think of the appeal of opioids, when you think about how easy it is to fall into a pattern of using them too much when you're dealing with either high levels of pain or anxiety or chronic illness, um, it is clear that there's some element of desperation, anxiety, fear that is gnawing at people. And it may be as basic as the disbelief that they'll ever have the same opportunities as their parents to, as you say, own a single family home, or it may be concern about much more significant issues. Are we still going to have a planet to live in the next 15 or 20 years? Will I have the opportunity to have a meaningful job through which I can pursue my purpose? Will my job be replaced by something like artificial intelligence over the course of time? And so I think that there are legitimately big issues that people are contending with that may be driving some of the anxieties that we're seeing at this point in time. I'd be very reluctant to dismiss them for ideological reasons. I can tell you that.
No, I agree with you. I don't think it's ideological. I think it is social anxiety, I believe. I think that, this whole freedom movement really is that, they don't want to be told what they can do and restricted, whether it be a vaccine or a mask or, where you can go and what you can do. And I don't think that that has an ideological bent, at least the way I used to think about
My doorbell is
ideologies.
ringing. Can we do that one over? Because I just have to go and open my door. I think my son just got home. Give me two
For sure.
seconds.
So I don't think it's necessarily ideological, but I do think that there is a sense that people aren't being heard. At least that's my read of things. And I ended up having an interview with a pollster. When was it? 2 years ago? I can't remember. When was the truck convoy? I can't remember now. Seems like eons ago. Was it 2 years ago? I think. And
It was during COVID measures, so it would probably be 2 years. Yeah,
I
it
think it
feels
was
like
2 years ago.
2022.
It's hard to remember. And we were talking about how not a majority of people, but 15% of the Canadian population were supportive of the trucker convoy. And and the comment was, 15% is a lot of people. And the prime minister should sit down and listen to 15% of the people. Doesn't have to follow what they say, doesn't need to do what they demand, but that's a lot of people that should be listened to. And I think that they didn't feel listened to. And I think that people too often, I'm finding that in city politics, I'm finding it in provincial politics, that people don't believe that we have governments these days that are listening. I spoke with a housing expert from Ottawa just the other day who wrote a big paper last August when Trudeau said housing isn't a federal priority and pointed out that, yes, it is a federal priority. Well, you know what? I think he listened, at least he heard, because this last week proves that now he thinks it is a federal priority and is taking some pretty significant action. Anyway, that's my analysis of it. Whether it's right or wrong, I'm not sure, but I think that there is a clamoring across Canada for people to be at least listened to. And I think that's a sense that we haven't been in the past. But we got to take a break for some messages. We're going to come back with Nic Ruszkowski in just 2 minutes, talking about the federal budget and some analysis that he's done of it. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Nic Ruszkowski. He's issued a really interesting analysis of the budget pre-announcements, and it's not completely conclusive, but I think what it says is popularity for the Trudeau government, or at least Trudeau, has gone up. Not the really the most favorable, but the most favorable and the somewhat favorable has gone up, and the negatives have gone down. And so I think that's kind of interesting. Nic, we were just talking about this cohort of young people that are very positive toward Pierre Poilievre. That it would appear that Trudeau's trying to win back, and I'm thinking that they just don't feel listened to. You were saying that you thought that maybe they were socially isolated. What's your assessment of this factor?
I think both of those things are true. I think one of the learnings, it's funny to say of a prime minister that after 8 years they're still learning new elements of the job, but I think it's actually true in this case. And I don't mean that with any sense of criticism. I think that one of the challenging aspects of the convoy, which is when we first saw these big demonstrations of anger from some of that younger cohort, is that Canadians wanted two things simultaneously. One was, as you said, to be heard, but the other is reassurance and access to leadership that gave the impression of being in control. And I think the Prime Minister, in calling for more civil behavior, calling out some of the acts of genuinely frightening racism and other extreme forms of ideology that were expressed by a small but meaningful number of people during the convoy. I think in doing that, he was trying to index more into leadership and perhaps lost sight of a little bit of the listening. And it's so easy to say in hindsight because the balance, seems so obvious now, 2 years after the fact. But in the moment, it would be a very difficult and delicate balancing act. But I think that what we're saying is both of us have elements of thought that I can get behind and agree with Brian. Definitely, people want to be heard. Definitely, people have anxiety, and the best way to prove that you are listening is to provide leadership that accounts for solutions to those things that are driving the anxiety that people feel.
Well, I got to tell you, I think it was the late 1970s, and I was a young liberal at the time. I had a position on the Young Liberal board, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, so Trudeau Sr. was prime minister at the time, and he was not doing well in the polls, and they thought that the country was adrift. And he went on. I don't know if it was called a listening tour, but it was effectively a listening tour. And he asked a whole bunch of young people to come to Ottawa to educate him on what the issues were. And a couple of buddies and myself popped in a car and we drove to Ottawa. We spent probably 4 hours talking, and there must have been 50 or 60 people in the room, and just expressing our issues and our assessments and our points of view to the prime minister. It was an incredible experience. And then we had lunch, and then he started to respond. I have never been more impressed with an individual's ability to remember, maybe not names, but issues, and policies and ideas that came from specific people. And he went around the room and said, this is, and synthesize. And maybe that's from his professorship experience. But he went back for a couple of hours in the afternoon and brought together all the different pieces of the puzzle that different people had put forward and synthesized it together to come out with a coherent roadmap that I think he really benefited from. And he probably did that a couple of times, if not dozens of times over the course of that summer. It was masterful. And he ended up turning the polls around to a certain extent. And so I think that, maybe the son could learn from his father if that experience was of any value. Because I do think that listening is an important thing to do. I used to work for Jimmy Pattison. He always, used that line over and over and over again. God gave us two ears and one mouth for a reason, Brian. Got to listen twice as much as you talk.
That's a fascinating anecdote, and it tells me that one of the questions that our technology and our use of it to do this analysis poses is, I think a big capital Q question. Is listening more effective and better achieved when you're one-on-one in person, when you've got the ability to commiserate over 4 hours with 60 different people? Or is it better done in the way that we do it with this mass sampling of several 100,000 people at a time, giving us their perspective on issues where the artificial intelligence algorithms that we use are giving us their best interpretation of what it is that people are being are concerned about in a succinct way, supported by natural language processing. And so I could say that both are listening, both are sincere efforts to try and understand what's happening. The jury might be out in terms of which one is more effective at producing a result that looks like the kind of responsiveness and care that people want to see in their leaders.
Let me ask you about this economic part of the budget. And you're right that the capital gains tax increases have caught, most of the public response that I've seen, at least in the business pages of the press and commentators in the last little while. But I think that one of the issues that people have been really, and again, maybe it's just the business press, I don't know, but talking about is the lack of prosperity and prosperity agenda and a growth agenda in Canada today. Our personal disposable income as a percentage of the United States is like 40% below. It used to be equal. Our productivity is down. We don't have a growth agenda. The former Minister of Finance has written a book about, effectively how we don't have business people in cabinet. We don't have a growth agenda. And the Prime Minister may not have been as focused on that as he was focused on other things. And one of the comments was made that we were bragging that, we had better than expected growth, which was like less than 1%. So, whoop-de-doo. We had better than average growth that was less than 1%. Do you think that one of the challenges we've got and that the government has in this budget is that they haven't put forward things that are going to move the country forward from a prosperity, from an economic development, from an entrepreneurial, from an innovation standpoint? Or are we just worried about getting taxed too much?
If I may, I want to pick up on one of your word choices because I think it might be indicative of part of the challenge here. I think that if you were to tell a member of the Liberal cabinet that they don't have a prosperity agenda, they'd look at you as if you were from another planet, and they would say, "Of course, we've got a prosperity agenda." But I think that what they would define as prosperity would look vastly different from what Bay Street or an entrepreneurial leader might consider prosperity. I don't think that they're as focused on competitiveness, productivity, innovation, which to me are the three core pillars of a 21st century growth strategy, as they are about fairness, equity, accessibility to opportunity. And so, if the debate is about prosperity, you have multiple different sides on that debate who probably each feel like they have an equally passionate claim to that particular concept or word. Where the discussion gets really interesting and meaningful to me is when you talk about those three pillars that I just mentioned: innovation, productivity, competitiveness, because that's one area where I would agree that the government, in order to perhaps achieve some of the big things that it's achieved over the course of the last 8 years, has perhaps under indexed some of that growth agenda. Although I'm quite certain that François-Philippe Champagne and his team at ISED would disagree with us on that as well.
I think that some of the things that they're doing in regards to industrial strategy that, some people thought was a strategy of a decade ago and didn't work, that have now come back, potentially are paying some dividends, but there certainly doesn't to be a lot. And, some people would argue if you really want to have a growth agenda, you should be reducing capital gains tax and giving incentives to people to invest in new innovation, and the accelerated depreciation that they've put in place for rental housing sort of goes to that, and for people that don't understand that, let me explain. By putting in place accelerated depreciation, what you're doing is effectively reducing the tax rate for people that are investing in building rental housing, and so therefore you're using a tax incentive to induce investment. Well, by increasing capital gains, you're giving people a disincentive to make investment, which Doesn't sound completely right. So they
Well,
are working on redistribution. There's no question. It is a redistributive
yeah.
kind of effort. But what it assumes is that the capital gains that will be the same that they would otherwise be it. So I can take a share of it and redistribute it. What an economist I think would say is that if you increase your capital gains tax, people are going to be less incented to invest, and so therefore there's going to be less capital gains there for you to tax.
Well, I've been an entrepreneur for the last 2 years. I've owned my business for the first time. I waited until the age of 48 to do that. And if I can just take a moment to bring you into the mind of this particular entrepreneur, I will tell you that my challenge with the capital gains policy that was announced this week is that it has the potential, if I don't stay completely true to myself, to have two very adverse effects. The first is there's no doubt that I have an appetite to be a part of a team that is aggressively growing a company through innovation like the kind we're talking about today, through some risk taking, through some investment, through some expansive thinking that moves us out of our traditional comfort zone. Um, but that's in part because I'm convinced that at some point down the line, let's call that a 10 to 15-year journey, there might be an opportunity for me to find an investor of an institutional type who might be willing to take a bet on the business that I'm helping build with my partners and colleagues. Now, if you eat away at the capital gains prospects that I might have and that might excite me and my partners about that kind of a journey, the risk is not necessarily a negative one, but you might cause us to hold on to our company for much longer. You might cause us to be therefore a little bit more risk averse and to be a little bit less innovative in terms of the envelope that we push to get to some of the growth that we think we can achieve. And so these are not inconsequential decisions when you look at it through the lens of the psychology of an entrepreneur who's thinking about these things on an ongoing basis. And I think that may be some of the perspective that might not have been invited to the discussion and the table when that policy was put together in the context of the budget.
Yeah, no, I agree with it. I'm a finance guy, and I just say what's happened is the discount rate has gone up. Your cost of capital has gone up, and so therefore, by definition, you're going to have to earn more. And 25% going to 33% above 200,000 means that it's 8% less return. And so therefore, if you're going to get 8% less return, you got to make 8% more to be in the same place. And so therefore, if every investment opportunity that you look at is 8% less productive above 200,000 bucks, but it's 8% less productive, you're not going to have as much money to invest, and the returns have got to be better. And why one of the reasons why we haven't invested a whole bunch of money in real estate in the last couple of years, we all know it's because interest rates have gone up by a couple of points. Well, think about if your cost of your own capital goes up because the tax rate has gone up, because capital gains tax rate has gone up, you're not going to accept every opportunity. You're going to have the more highly returning opportunities to get interested in investing in. So it's just I think it's a mistake, because I do think we need that innovation, productive opportunity. And I come back to, I don't think it's redistribution, because I think what's going to end up happening is you're going to have less capital gains out there. And so if you have less capital gains out there, there's not that capital gains to tax in that you can redistribute. So anyway, interesting conversation. We got to bring it to a close. We're going to take a 2-minute break, and we're going to come back with Nic Ruszkowski, and I'm going to ask him one last important question that I've got for it. But before we do that, Nic, if people want to follow up on your research, do you publish it on a website? Is there a Twitter feed or a LinkedIn feed or an X feed or something like that they should follow if they want to get some of your research? How do they best do?
They should follow Tactics Public Affairs and Government Relations on LinkedIn, where they can get that analysis in both French and English, and our website, tactics.ca. So those are the two places where you can find that. And we'll be happy to take any questions that people have for us in those platforms.
Nic Ruszkowski, thank you. Back in 2 minutes with Nic. Stay with us, everyone. Got one last really important question for him. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Nic Ruszkowski. The name of your firm, sir, is?
Tactics, government relations, and public affairs.
And he publishes some interesting research, and I recommend him if you want to follow to find out his research. And this research that you sent out was really kind of interesting because what it did is it took a look at several of these different issues that the federal government had announced pre-budget, and you used AI, I guess, to track what people on social media were saying about these different issues and whether they were making positive comments or negative comments, and you came out with a ratio of positive comments to negative comments to analyze it. You may remember I was doing a doctorate in business and I took a course that was really quite interesting. They talked about social capital, and there was this famous pair of psychologists out of Stanford University, Gottman, I think was their name, and they did a study of positive versus negative, and it was actually published in a book called The Mathematics of Marriage, if you can believe it. And they said that to have a positive impact, you got to have 7 positives to every 1 negative, because negatives are far more powerful in our society and in our psyche. We react like crazy to get rid of a negative, but we like positives. And so therefore they said it's not really a positive unless it's 7 positives to 1 negative. So you had a couple that were like, 1.5 and 2 to 1. Is that really a positive, or do you have to have a lot bigger one?
I think I know exactly the study that you're talking about. The Gottman Institute does a lot of work in the world of relationship dynamics in particular, and social capital is definitely one of those things. I would say that based on what we've seen so far, those quote unquote hits or highlights are sufficient to garner short-term relief from some of the frustration that is belying Justin Trudeau and his government. They're going to have to be particularly convincing and compelling in order to get the mentions that we're talking about from a 2.5 to 1 or a 3 to 1 or 1.5 to 1 ratio to a 7 to 1 ratio. So I think the government has invited an enormous amount of workload onto its shoulders if it wants to see a larger return on its budget, so to speak. And we won't know how that plays out for a while yet. My honest feeling is that this budget will be short-lived in terms of the uptick that is given this government. How short-lived, I don't know. But the government will still have positive lessons to draw from it. One of them being, you can score a lot of points by encroaching into areas of provincial jurisdiction when you're a federal government. And so one of the questions that we ask in that analysis is what might come next as a result of that lesson. So that's what I want to say about that, Brian, without getting too caught up into the science of the 7 to 1 ratio that the Gottmans master much better than I do.
So maybe it's in relationships, not necessarily in politics. So you got to have 7 to 1. Though I did hear a political consultant that said you have to have 7 impressions before someone actually remembers your political name or your brand name. Let me ask you one last question then. I ended up having a fascinating conversation with someone this weekend that said that Poilievre's biggest problem is he's peaked way too soon. There's no way. Polls are never static. They're always dynamic. They always change. And to be 20 points up now is a death nail. You can't stay 20 points up for a year and a half. What do you think?
Well, I think, can I say 2 things at once? Change is the only constant. And so things can indeed change. But we also know that in politics, the old adage is true that governments defeat themselves. And so one has to ask themselves whether there's such a thing as peaking too soon when you have a government that's showing signs of a definite waning in popularity. And so this may have less to do with the magic of Pierre Poilievre and more to do with fatigue with the current government.
Nic Ruszkowski, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate chatting with you about your perception and analysis of pre-budget. And it'll be fascinating to talk to you in a week's time to find out what post-budget you concluded.
I look forward to it.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960M. You can stream me online at www.saga960m.ca. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Nick.